Frank Henderson sat in his favorite wooden rocking chair on the front porch of his small white house, his weathered hands resting on the armrests as he watched the morning sun rise over his beloved garden. At 93 years old, his body might have grown slower, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he served in World War II. His daily routine brought him comfort. Wake up at 6 a.m., make his coffee just the way he liked it, black with one sugar, and spend the early morning hours tending to his colorful flower beds. The neighbors all knew Frank as the friendly old veteran who always had a story to share and a smile to give. Children would wave to him as they passed by on their bikes, and he would wave back, reminded of his own youth so many years ago. His small house on Maple Street hadn't changed much in the 50 years he'd lived there. The paint might have faded a bit, and the steps might creak more than they used to, but to Frank, it was heaven. Every Saturday morning, like clockwork, his grandson Tommy would visit. Today was no different as the young man's blue sedan pulled into the driveway. Tommy, a college student with his grandfather's kind eyes, carried a bag of fresh bagels, their weekly tradition. "Grandpa," Tommy called out, climbing the porch steps. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Frank's face lit up at the sight of his grandson. Tommy was the spitting image of Frank's son Robert, who had passed away 5 years ago in a car accident. Having Tommy visit helped ease the loneliness that had settled in after both Frank's wife Martha and their only son had gone. "Come sit with me, son." Frank patted the chair next to him. "The roses are blooming early this year. Your grandmother would have loved to see them." As they shared their breakfast, Frank did what he did best, tell stories. He spoke of the war, not the scary parts, but the moments of friendship and courage that had shaped his life. He told Tommy about meeting Martha at a dance hall in 1946, just after he returned home. How she had worn a blue dress that matched the summer sky, and how he knew right then that she was the one. "Your grandmother," Frank chuckled, pointing to the garden. "She's the one who taught me everything I know about those flowers. Said a man needed a gentle hobby to balance out the rough edges life gives you." Tommy listened intently, just as he always did. He knew these stories by heart, but he never tired of hearing them. Sometimes he would ask questions, and Frank would reveal new details, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. The peaceful morning was interrupted by the rumble of motorcycles passing by. Frank paused his story, watching as 3 bikes roared past his house toward the empty lot next door. The lot had been vacant since old Mr. Johnson's hardware store burned down 2 years ago. "They've been coming around more often," Frank mentioned, his voice carrying a hint of concern. "Started about a month ago. Just a few at first, now more and more showing up." Tommy frowned. "Are they causing any trouble, Grandpa?" Frank shook his head. "Not yet. Just noise for now. But change is coming. I can feel it in these old bones of mine." As the morning wore on, they moved to the garden where Frank showed Tommy how to properly prune the rose bushes. His hands might shake a bit now, but years of practice made the work look easy. Each snip was precise, each movement careful and purposeful. "Remember, Tommy," Frank explained, "gardens are like life. You get out what you put in, treat them with respect, give them attention and care, and they'll reward you with beauty." The rest of their morning passed peacefully, with Frank sharing more stories and wisdom while they worked together in the garden. When it was time for Tommy to leave, Frank hugged his grandson tightly, thankful for these precious moments they shared. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Frank settled back into his routine. He made himself a simple lunch, read his newspaper, and tended to his afternoon gardening tasks. Everything was as it should be, peaceful and orderly, just the way Frank liked it. But as more motorcycles rumbled past his house toward the empty lot, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life was about to change. Looking at his prized roses, Frank whispered to himself, "Well, Martha, looks like things might get interesting around here." He smiled, remembering how she always said life had a way of testing you when you least expected it. The first real problem started on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Frank was watering his rose garden when 5 motorcycles roared into the empty lot next door, their engines so loud that the birds scattered from his bird feeder in fear. The bikers were younger men, most of them wearing black leather jackets with a Silver Wolf logo on the back. Frank watched as they unloaded coolers of beer and set up chairs in the lot. Their loud laughter and cursing carried easily over to his yard, but he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on his flowers. Everything was fine until one of them threw an empty can that landed among his prized roses. "Excuse me," Frank called out, his voice firm despite his age. "Would you mind picking that up?" The youngest biker, a man with spiky hair and multiple tattoos, laughed. "What's that, old-timer? Can't hear you over all this awesome." He revved his motorcycle engine, making his friends laugh. Frank's hands tightened around his garden hose, but he kept his cool. He'd faced worse in the war. Much worse. Still, it hurt to see such disrespect. In his day, young people showed their elders courtesy. Over the next few weeks, the situation got worse. The bikers started showing up almost every day, sometimes in groups of 10 or more. They'd play loud music until late at night, making it impossible for Frank to sleep. Empty cans and cigarette butts would blow into his yard, and their motorcycles kicked up dust that covered his carefully tended flowers. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch trying to read his newspaper, a group of bikers started doing tricks in the lot, their tires spraying gravel everywhere. Some stones hit his porch, and one even knocked over his coffee cup. Mrs. Rodriguez, his neighbor from across the street, came over the next morning looking worried. "Mr. Henderson," she said, wringing her hands. "They threatened to damage my car when I asked them to move their motorcycles from in front of my driveway." Frank's military training had taught him to observe before acting. He noticed that while most of the bikers were troublemakers, their leader, a tall man they called the Storm, sometimes tried to keep them in line. But even he seemed to be losing control of the younger members. The breaking point came during Tommy's next visit. As they sat on the porch sharing their usual Saturday morning bagels, 3 bikers showed up early, their engines deliberately revving louder as they passed Frank's house. "This isn't right, Grandpa," Tommy said, watching his grandfather's face grow tired and sad. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. Let me call the police." Frank shook his head. "Not yet, son. Sometimes people just need to be reminded of who they're dealing with. Your grandmother always said that everyone deserves a chance to do the right thing." But that afternoon, after Tommy left, things got even worse. A group of bikers started drinking early, and their behavior became more reckless. They rode their motorcycles in circles in the lot, getting closer and closer to Frank's property line. The dust was so thick it covered everything in a brown haze. Frank went outside to cover his roses, trying to protect them from the dust storm. As he worked, he heard snickering behind him. 2 of the younger bikers were watching him, making jokes about Grandpa's flower patch. "Hey, old man," one called out, "maybe it's time to move to a retirement home. This ain't the place for garden parties anymore." Frank straightened up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. He looked at these young men, seeing not just troublemakers, but lost souls who had forgotten the meaning of respect. In their faces, he saw shadows of young men he'd known in the war. Good men who sometimes lost their way but could find it again with the right guidance. That night, as Frank lay in bed listening to the distant rumble of motorcycles, he made a decision. He wasn't going to be bullied out of the home he'd shared with Martha for 50 years. He wasn't going to let them destroy the garden where his grandchildren had learned to walk. He faced down enemies in war. He could face down these misguided young men. Opening his closet, Frank pulled out an old wooden box. Inside was his military uniform, still pressed and clean, with rows of medals that told stories of courage and sacrifice. Tomorrow, he decided, it was time to remind these boys what real strength looked like. Not the kind that came from loud engines and intimidation, but the kind that came from standing up for what's right. The morning started like any other for Frank, but everything changed when he stepped outside to get his newspaper. His heart nearly stopped at what he saw. Someone had knocked over his mailbox during the night, leaving it bent and broken on the ground. Tire tracks cut ugly paths through his flower beds, crushing the roses he and Martha had planted together on their 40th anniversary. Frank stood there in his old checkered robe, his hands shaking as he surveyed the damage. These weren't just flowers to him, they were memories. Each rose bush held a story. The yellow ones Martha had insisted on planting when Tommy was born, the red ones they'd added after their daughter-in-law's wedding, and the white ones that reminded him of Martha's wedding dress. As he knelt to touch one of the crushed flowers, his knees creaking in protest, he heard Tommy's car pull into the driveway. His grandson's usual cheerful expression turned to anger as he took in the scene. "Grandpa!" Tommy rushed over, nearly dropping the bag of bagels he always brought. "What happened? Who did this?" Frank picked up a motorcycle glove lying half buried in the dirt. It had the same silver wolf logo he'd seen on the bikers' jackets. "I think we both know who, son." Tommy pulled out his phone. That's it. I'm calling the police right now. This is vandalism. They can't get away with this. Wait. Frank placed his hand over Tommy's phone. Let me handle this my way first. Your way? Tommy looked worried. Grandpa, these aren't reasonable people. They're dangerous. What if they hurt you? Frank smiled, a glint of steel in his old eyes. Son, I survived Normandy. I've faced worse than a bunch of troublemakers on motorcycles. Together, they spent the morning trying to salvage what they could of the garden. Mrs. Rodriguez came over to help, bringing them cold lemonade and sharing her own stories of recent harassment from the bikers. Other neighbors drove by slowly, looking concerned but too afraid to stop. As they worked, more motorcycles arrived at the lot. The bikers seemed cockier than usual, shooting obvious looks at Frank's destroyed garden and laughing among themselves. One even had the nerve to wave mockingly at Frank. Look at them, Tommy muttered, his hands clenching into fists. They think they're so tough, picking on a 93-year-old man. Frank straightened up from where he'd been examining a damaged rose bush. You know what your grandmother would say about all this? Tommy shook his head. She'd say, Frank Henderson, sometimes the good Lord sends us troubles to see what we're made of. And you know what? She was right. Frank looked at his grandson with determination in his eyes. These boys think they know something about strength because they can destroy things. But real strength? Real strength is about standing up for what's right, even when you're scared. As the day wore on, more neighbors gathered quietly in Frank's yard, helping to repair what they could. Mrs. Rodriguez's teenage sons came over with tools to fix the mailbox. Mr. Chen from the house behind Frank's brought over some of his own flowers to help replace the damaged ones. The bikers watched this gathering with growing unease. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected. Instead of cowering in fear, the neighborhood was coming together. Late that afternoon, as Tommy was getting ready to leave, he made one last attempt to convince his grandfather to call the police. Grandpa, please. At least let me stay with you tonight. I'm worried about what they might do next. Frank hugged his grandson tightly. Tommy, do you know what I learned in the war? The most important battles aren't won with fists or weapons. They're won with courage and dignity. These boys think they're fighting me, but they're really fighting against themselves. They just don't know it yet. After Tommy left, Frank went inside and opened his old footlocker. Inside, beneath his uniform and medals, lay his combat diary. He began to write down everything that had happened, just as he'd done during the war. Times, dates, descriptions, every detail mattered. As night fell, Frank sat on his porch, listening to the loud music and laughter from the lot next door. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just an old man watching his peaceful life slip away. Tonight, he was a soldier again, planning his strategy. Tomorrow, he decided, would be the day he made his stand. In the darkness, Frank smiled. These boys were about to learn what real courage looked like. Frank woke up before sunrise the next morning, his old military habits kicking in. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, reviewing the small notebook where he'd been documenting everything. Like planning a mission in the war, he knew that good intelligence was crucial to victory. In his neat handwriting, he'd recorded license plate numbers, times of arrival and departure, and descriptions of key members. He even drawn a rough map of how they positioned their bikes in the lot. Most importantly, he noted the power structure within the group. Who gave orders, who followed them, and who caused the most trouble. Know your enemy, Frank muttered to himself, remembering his old surgeon's words. These weren't enemies, not really. Just lost young men who needed to be reminded of better values. Frank pulled out his old Kodak camera, the one Tommy had taught him to use. Over the past week, he'd quietly taken photos of the bikers damaging property, drinking in public, and harassing neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez had given him her cell phone videos of them blocking her driveway. Mr. Chen had security camera footage from his store showing them intimidating customers. Around mid-morning, Frank made his first move. He walked slowly down his street, knocking on doors. At each house, he spoke quietly with his neighbors, showing them his evidence and sharing his plan. Many were scared at first, but something about the old veteran's quiet confidence gave them courage. Remember how we won the war? He told Mrs. Rodriguez when she expressed doubt. Not just with weapons, but with unity. When good people stand together, bullies don't stand a chance. By afternoon, Frank had organized a neighborhood watch group. Mr. Chen offered his store as a meeting place. The Martinez boys, who worked at the local garage, volunteered to document any motorcycle repairs that might be linked to vandalism. Even shy Mrs. Peterson, who rarely left her house, agreed to keep a log of late-night disturbances. But Frank's most interesting discovery came when he visited the local Veterans Center. The clerk there, after seeing Frank's military ID, shared some surprising information about Mike, the Storm Thompson, the biker gang's leader. Vietnam vet, the clerk said, showing Frank an old photo. Purple Heart recipient, used to come to support groups here, talking about helping other vets adjust to civilian life. That was before he started running with the wrong crowd. This information changed everything for Frank. He wasn't just dealing with troublemakers, he was dealing with a fellow soldier who had lost his way. Back home, Frank spent the afternoon in his garage, carefully cleaning and pressing his old uniform. Each medal told a story of sacrifice and courage. As he polished them, he remembered the men he'd served with, how they'd stood together against real evil. Tommy stopped by after work, worried about his grandfather's quiet determination. "What exactly are you planning, Grandpa?" he asked, watching Frank organize his evidence. Frank showed him the photos, the notes, the testimony he'd gathered. "In war, son, you learn that victory isn't always about who's strongest. It's about who's smartest and who is right on their side. But these guys are dangerous," Tommy protested. "They'd already shown they don't care about hurting people." Frank placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "That's where you're wrong, Tommy. They do care. They've just forgotten how to show it. Sometimes people act tough because they're lost, not because they're bad." As evening approached, Frank heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles arriving at the lot. But tonight, instead of staying inside, he sat on his porch and watched them openly, taking notes and photos. Some of the younger bikers noticed and revved their engines threateningly, but Frank didn't flinch. "What's your next move?" Tommy asked before leaving. Frank smiled, the same smile he'd worn before important missions. "Tomorrow, I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Thompson, veteran to veteran. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up and speak the truth." As night fell, Frank made one final entry in his notebook. He wrote about Martha, about how she always said that love was stronger than fear. He wrote about the war, about how true courage meant doing what was right, even when you were scared. Tomorrow would be the day of confrontation, but tonight, Frank Henderson slept peacefully, knowing he was ready. In his dreams, he saw Martha tending their roses, smiling at him with pride. The next morning brought an unexpected twist to Frank's carefully laid plans. As he sat on his porch watching the bikers arrive, he noticed something different about Mike, the Storm Thompson. The gang leader arrived alone, earlier than usual, and spent several minutes staring at a small object in his hands before putting it back in his jacket pocket. Frank's military training had taught him to recognize when a man was carrying a heavy burden, and it wasn't always something you could see. Through his binoculars, he observed how Mike would wince slightly whenever the younger members got too rowdy, how his shoulders tensed when they harassed passing cars. Around noon, Frank spotted his opportunity. Mike had walked away from the group, standing alone near the edge of the lot, smoking a cigarette. The old veteran grabbed the manila envelope containing his research and made his way slowly, but purposefully toward the biker leader. Some of the younger bikers noticed him approaching and started to move forward, but Mike held up his hand, stopping them. He watched Frank with curious eyes, taking another drag from his cigarette. "Mr. Thompson," Frank said, his voice clear and steady. "I believe we need to talk, soldier to soldier." Mike's eyes widened slightly at being addressed so formally. "How do you know my name?" Frank pulled out an old photograph from the Veterans Center. It showed a younger Mike in his military uniform, proud and straight-backed, receiving his Purple Heart. "We have more in common than you might think." For a moment, something flickered across Mike's face, recognition, perhaps, or remembrance of who he used to be. He glanced back at his gang, then nodded toward a quiet corner of the lot. 5 minutes, old-timer. That's all you get." As they walked, Frank noticed Mike's slight limp, an old war injury probably. They settled on some concrete blocks, far enough from the others to talk privately. "I was there in 45, Frank began, "but you had it worse in Nam. Jungle warfare's a different kind of hell." Mike's tough exterior cracked slightly. You don't know anything about it. Maybe not that war, Frank agreed, but I know about coming home. About trying to find your place when the world feels too quiet and too loud all at once. Frank opened his envelope, showing Mike the photos and documentation of the gang's activities. This isn't who you are, son. I've read about your work at the Veterans Center, how you helped other soldiers adjust to civilian life. Mike's hands trembled slightly as he looked through the evidence. Things change, old man. People change. Do they? Frank pulled out his own military photo. When I came home, I was angry too. Felt like nobody understood what we'd been through. Then my Martha taught me about gardening. He smiled at the memory. Said sometimes you need to create something beautiful to balance out the ugly things you've seen. Mike stood up abruptly, pacing. It's not that simple anymore. These kids, they look up to me. They need direction. And what direction are you giving them? Frank asked gently. Teaching them to harass old men and destroy gardens? Is that the legacy you want to leave, soldier? Mike stopped pacing, his face a storm of emotions. From the other side of the lot, his gang watched curiously, wondering what was happening between their leader and the old man they'd been tormenting. You know what the hardest part of being a leader is? Frank continued. Sometimes it means admitting you've led your men down the wrong path, but it also means you have the power to lead them back. Mike pulled out the object he'd been looking at earlier, his purple heart. I used to be proud of this, he said quietly. You should still be proud, Frank replied. The man who earned that medal is still in there, and he knows the difference between right and wrong. Their conversation was interrupted by the roar of motorcycles as some of the younger members started showing off, nearly hitting Mrs. Rodriguez's car as she drove past. Frank watched Mike's face darken with something that looked like shame. I got proof of everything they've done, Frank said, standing slowly. Enough to cause real trouble with the law, but that's not what I want. What you want? Mike asked, his voice barely audible over the motorcycle engines. Frank looked him straight in the eye. I want to help you remember who you really are, soldier. And maybe together, we can help these boys find a better way. As Frank turned to leave, he noticed Mike was still holding his purple heart, running his thumb over its surface, lost in thought. Sometimes, Frank knew, the biggest battles were fought in the heart. The following Saturday morning dawned clear and cool. Frank stood in front of his mirror, carefully putting on his military uniform for the first time in years. Each medal told a story, each crease in the fabric held a memory. His hands shook slightly as he pinned his combat medals to his chest, but his eyes were clear and determined. Tommy arrived early, worried about his grandfather's plan. Are you sure about this, Grandpa? Let me stay with you at least. Frank shook his head. No, son. Some battles a man has to face alone. He straightened his tie one last time. Besides, I'm not alone. Your grandmother's roses are watching. By mid-morning, the bikers had started gathering in the lot. More than usual had shown up today. Word had spread that something was going to happen. Frank watched through his window as Mike, the Storm Thompson, arrived, noticing how the leader kept glancing toward his house. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., Frank stepped out onto his porch. The sight of him in full military dress uniform caused several bikers to stop mid-conversation. His medals caught the morning sun, sending tiny flashes of light across the lot. Frank walked slowly but purposefully toward the group. His back was straight, his chin high, just as it had been when he'd marched into battle all those years ago. The younger bikers nudged each other, some laughing nervously, others falling silent. Look at Grandpa playing dress-up, one of them called out, but his voice wavered when no one joined in his laughter. Mike stepped forward, and Frank could see he was wearing his own military medals pinned to his leather jacket. The two veterans faced each other, separated by years but united by service. You've got guts, old man, Mike said loud enough for everyone to hear. I'll give you that. Frank's voice, when he spoke, carried across the lot with surprising strength. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to remind you of something we both learned in service, honor. He turned to address the whole group. You boys think you're tough because you can intimidate old folks and destroy gardens. But let me tell you about real toughness. Frank pointed to one of his medals. This one? Got it pulling 3 men to safety under heavy fire. Was I tough? No, I was terrified. But I did what was right. The younger bikers shifted uncomfortably. Some removed their sunglasses, seeing Frank clearly for the first time. Your leader here, Frank continued, gesturing to Mike, he knows about real courage too. That Purple Heart he earned? That's not about being tough. It's about sacrifice, about putting others before yourself. Mike's face worked with emotion as Frank spoke. Several of his gang members were looking at him with new eyes, noticing his military medals for the first time. You want to be a brotherhood? Frank's voice grew stronger. Want to be respected? Earn it. Not by making people fear you, but by making them thank God you're around. A younger biker with spiky hair, the one who'd thrown the first can into Frank's garden, stepped forward. Why should we listen to you, old man? Because, Mike suddenly spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. He's right. He turned to face his gang. We've lost our way, started acting like the kind of men we used to fight against. A murmur went through the group. Mike walked over to stand beside Frank, removing his leather jacket to reveal a faded military tattoo on his arm. This man, Mike said, pointing to Frank, he fought for the same things we did. Freedom. Justice. The right of people to live in peace. He looked around at his gang. And what have we been doing? Terrorizing old folks? Destroying gardens? Is that what we fought for? The lot fell silent except for the distant sound of birds in Frank's garden. The younger bikers looked at their boots, at their bikes, anywhere but at the two veterans standing before them. It's not too late to change, Frank said quietly, to become the kind of men people look up to instead of fear. Mike stepped forward, facing his gang. I've made mistakes, leading you down this path, but that changes today. He turned to Frank, standing at attention, and saluted. Sir, we owe you an apology. One by one, the bikers began to understand. This wasn't just about an old man and his garden. This was about honor, about choosing what kind of men they wanted to be. The spiky-haired young biker was the first to step forward. We'll fix your garden, sir. Everything we destroyed. We'll make it right. Frank returned Mike's salute, his eyes misty but his voice clear. That's all I ever wanted, boys. A chance for you to make it right. The transformation didn't happen overnight. When it began, it was something remarkable to witness. The morning after Frank's confrontation, he was having his usual early coffee when he heard motorcycles approaching. Instead of the usual rowdy entrance, the bikes pulled up quietly. Mike and 5 of his men walked up to Frank's front porch, carrying tools and garden supplies. We'd like to start fixing what we broke, sir, Mike said, holding up a box of new rose bushes. If you'll teach us how. Frank set down his coffee cup and smiled. First lesson of gardening, boys, it's always better with a hot cup of coffee. He went inside and brought out enough cups for everyone. Over the next few hours, Frank taught them the basics of gardening. His patient instructions reminded Mike of their military training days, clear, precise, and purposeful. The younger bikers, who had never done anything like this before, found themselves genuinely interested in learning how to properly plant roses. Careful with that root ball, Frank instructed the spiky-haired youth, who they all called Spike. Treat it gently, like you're handling something precious, because you are. Spike's hands, usually more comfortable gripping motorcycle handlebars, slowly became more confident with the delicate work. My mom used to have a garden, he said quietly, before she got sick. I'd forgotten about that. Throughout the week, more bikers started showing up to help. Some worked on rebuilding Frank's mailbox, making it stronger than before. Others helped clean up the empty lot, removing trash and debris that had accumulated over months. Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't believe her eyes when she saw 2 burly bikers helping her carry groceries from her car. Mr. Chen was equally surprised when several gang members started patrolling near his store, not to cause trouble, but to prevent it. The biggest change was in Mike himself. He started sharing stories about his time in Vietnam with the younger members, not the glorified war stories they expected, but honest talks about courage, fear, and the importance of looking out for each other. You know what real strength is? He told them one afternoon while they were taking a break from garden work. It's what Mr. Henderson showed us. Standing up for what's right, even when you're alone. Being gentle when you could be harsh. That's the kind of strength that matters. Frank observed all this from his porch, often sharing coffee and stories with the men who had once terrorized his neighborhood. He told them about Martha, about how she believed every garden needed both strong plants and delicate flowers to be complete. Just like a community, he'd say, watching them work. Needs all kinds of people to make it whole. One particularly meaningful moment came when Spike discovered an old photograph in Frank's garden shed. It showed a young Frank in his uniform, standing beside an equally young Martha in front of their newly purchased house. "You were our age," Spike realized, handling the photo carefully. "That's right," Frank nodded. "Everyone's young once. Question is, what do you do with that youth?" The photo made its way around the group, and something changed in how they saw Frank. He wasn't just an old man anymore, he was someone who had lived a full life, who had loved and fought and built something meaningful. At the end of the week, the neighborhood had transformed. The empty lot, once a source of fear, was being converted into a community garden. Mike had proposed the idea, and everyone, bikers and neighbors alike, had embraced it. "We could teach kids about gardening," one of the bikers suggested. "Keep them out of trouble, you know?" Frank watched as these men, who had seemed so lost just days ago, found new purpose in building rather than destroying. He thought about what Martha would say if she could see them now, these rough-looking bikers carefully tending to roses and planning community projects. The most touching moment came when Mike presented Frank with a special gift. The gang had pooled their money to buy a custom-made garden bench, made of solid oak. On its back was a carved inscription, "In honor of Frank Henderson, who taught us that true strength blooms in a garden." As Frank ran his weathered hand over the inscription, he smiled. Martha always said everyone deserves a second chance. She would have loved seeing her garden bring so much healing. The bikers stood around him, no longer a gang but a group of men finding their way back to who they were meant to be. In the gentle evening light, Frank's roses swayed in the breeze, their blooms a testament to the power of patience, courage, and the willingness to believe in change. 6 months had passed since the day Frank faced down the bikers in his military uniform. The neighborhood had changed so much that visitors often had trouble believing the stories about how it used to be. The empty lot, once a source of fear and tension, had transformed into Veterans Victory Garden, a thriving community space that brought people together from all walks of life. On this particular Sunday afternoon, Frank sat on his custom oak bench, watching the scene before him with quiet satisfaction. Mike and his men had organized a community barbecue, something that had become a monthly tradition. The smell of grilled hamburgers filled the air as children played safely under the watchful eyes of the bikers who had once terrorized these same streets. "Coffee, Mr. Henderson." Spike appeared beside him, holding out a steaming cup. His hair was shorter now, and he wore a garden volunteer t-shirt over his leather jacket. He had recently enrolled in community college, studying to become a landscape designer. Frank accepted the coffee with a smile. "Thank you, son. Martha always said a garden party isn't complete without good coffee and better company." The garden itself had become something special. Besides Frank's restored roses, there were now vegetable plots tended by neighborhood families, a small playground built by the bikers, and even a memorial section dedicated to veterans from different wars. Mike had made sure each branch of service was represented with its own special flower bed. Mrs. Rodriguez was there, teaching some of the younger bikers how to make her famous empanadas. Mr. Chen's teenage sons were playing basketball with other neighborhood kids on the small court the bikers had built. The sense of fear that had once gripped the community had been replaced by something warm and welcoming. Tommy arrived with his wife and their new baby, Frank's first great-grandchild. The elderly veteran beamed as Mike carefully held the infant, his tough biker image softening completely as the baby grabbed his finger. "You know," Mike said, gently rocking the baby, "none of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up to us that day, Mr. Henderson." Frank shook his head. "I just reminded you of who you really were. The change came from within you boys." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as more people gathered for the barbecue. The bikers, now known throughout the area for their community service, had started a mentoring program for troubled youth. They taught kids about motorcycle maintenance, but also about respect, honor, and the importance of giving back to their community. "Hey, Mr. H," called out one of the younger bikers. "Tell us the story about how you and Mrs. Henderson started this garden." Frank smiled, seeing how many people gathered around to listen. Even those who had heard the story many times before loved to hear him tell it. As he spoke about Martha's dream of creating a place of beauty and peace, he noticed how the bikers listened intently, their faces soft with understanding. Later that evening, as the party was winding down, Mike and his men presented Frank with a surprise. They had created a small bronze plaque for the garden entrance. It read, "Every garden needs both strength and gentleness to grow. In loving memory of Martha Henderson, and in honor of Frank Henderson, who taught us that true courage blooms in unexpected places." Frank's eyes misted over as he read the words. He looked around at these men who had become like sons to him, at the neighbors who had become true friends, at the garden that had become so much more than just flowers and vegetables. Tommy helped his grandfather stand, and together they walked through the garden. Frank pointed out each rose bush, telling stories about the past, but also sharing his hopes for the future. The garden had become a living legacy, not just of his life with Martha, but of the power of transformation and redemption. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Frank sat back on his bench. Mike and several others gathered around him, as they often did now, to hear his stories and wisdom. Children played nearby, their laughter mixing with the gentle evening breeze. "You know what Martha would say about all this?" Frank asked, his voice warm with memory. "What's that, sir?" Mike asked. "She'd say sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in the most unexpected places," Frank replied, looking at the transformed lot and the transformed men around him. "And that every flower, no matter how tough its beginning, deserves the chance to bloom." The stars began to appear overhead as the community lingered in the garden, none wanting the evening to end. In the gentle darkness, Frank's roses released their sweet perfume, a reminder that from even the hardest ground, beauty could grow.